and welcome to the Steel Ministry. Today we are going to be discussing the Steel Ministry, which is, of course, the religion of the Final Empire. But it isn't just the religion of the Final Empire. It is also their government and the basis of their entire societal structure and every piece of their daily life. When reading the first era of Mistborn and thinking about the Steel Ministry, we're focusing so much on the Ska and the noblemen, and we're not spending a lot of time, especially after Book 1, thinking about the obligators and the inquisitors. There's so much that we really don't know because, as far as page time, we only get so much information. But there's actually a lot that really informs the whole of life on Scadrial in a way that I just find it so fascinating. The Steel Ministry is broken up into 4 parts, known as cantons: the Canton of Finance, the Canton of Resources, the Canton of Orthodoxy, and the Canton of Inquisition. The first canton that we become acquainted with is the Canton of Finance. That is where the obligator is from that Vin and Cammon go to meet to make a deal about transporting funds. The Canton of Finance is exactly what you think it is. It's the bank of the entire Final Empire. It is also the first government building that we see in Luthadel because Vin and Cammon go to visit the Canton of Finance headquarters in Luthadel. The Canton of Finance is entirely responsible for the funds of the Final Empire and the transportation of said funds. And that's really their job. They are responsible for that. You'll notice a theme here where the cantons, not all of them are equally yoked as far as carrying the burden of the faith and the religion, the same way that it's not expected of the people of the Final Empire to really revere and believe in a faith way or worship the Lord Ruler, because that is mostly put on the Canton of Orthodoxy and the Canton of Inquisition. So while the obligators that we see at the Canton of Finance are very much priests, they're not priests in any traditional sense that we identify in our Western society here. Moving on to the Canton of Resources. The Canton of Resources is responsible for trade, taxation, and transportation otherwise, not including transportation of funds. Although there is one thing that they transport that does come in contact with the Canton of Finance, and I think you know what it is. The obligators at the Canton of Resources are known to be more philosophical, analytical minds. Those are the people who kind of gravitate towards that canton. The Canton of Resources are also the obligators that you see at the Pits of Hathsin. They are involved mostly with the transport of ATM, not just to Luthadel, hidden within the funds that are being moved by the Canton of Finance, but they are also responsible for getting it to the Trust Warren, which is the Contra homeland, to hide it from ruin. The obligators from this canton that work at the Pits of Hathsin are the ones who are extracting the beads from the geodes themselves. Moving on to the Canton of Orthodoxy. This is where things get really interesting to me, at least. The Canton of Orthodoxy presides entirely over the religious aspect of the Steel Ministry. These obligators are the ones who are working with the Lord Ruler. They are doing their religious rites. These obligators are also the ones typically overseeing agreements and contracts as well. You can always tell when looking at an obligator which canton they're from based on the intricate eye tattoos that they have on their face. They also have different tattoos to signify their rank. That being said, we don't have formal representations exactly of what these look like yet, so here's hoping we get some soon. Moving on away from obligators to the Canton of Inquisition. The Canton of Inquisition is, of course, where we get the Steel Inquisitors from. They are the law enforcement of the land. They enforce the law for the noblemen, Ska, the obligators themselves, and they are intense, to say the least. According to the history that we have, the Canton of Inquisition was founded around the 6th century of the Lord Ruler's reign. So it hasn't been that long compared to how long he's been ruling, a little over 1,000 years. There has been a long-standing rivalry between the Inquisitors and the Obligators at the point that we are reading them in the Final Empire, which comes to a head at the end of the book when High Lord Tavinian, also known as Vin's father, gets killed for having a Ska child, and Kara the Inquisitor is elated to finally be given the chance to preside over the religion. There has been a lot of tension between them, likely due to a sense of not just enhanced reverence, but a connection that the Inquisitors through Hemalurgy would have had to the Lord Ruler. When I say connected, just to be clear, I'm not saying that they are hemalurgically connected to the Lord Ruler and therefore feel closer to him. It is the fact that, first of all, I think they're mutilating their bodies for their god. So there is something to be said there, although more to come on that in a minute. There is also this idea of they would have more ruin in them by using his investiture, his magic system, the same way that Rashik also was by being hemalurgically advanced himself through his metal mines. But it's just kind of important, I think, also that that is noted, that there was this extra sense of fervor and reverence in the Inquisitors because of, in part, I would say, the influence of hemalurgy on their spirit webs and their personalities. One thing that we often critique the Lord Ruler for, rightfully so, are his breeding programs that he runs with the Terrace. But did you know that it was actually the idea of the Inquisitors? And the Lord Ruler was actually not really on board at first, and then he provisionally agreed and ended up just sticking with it. Still not good. But I would assume this also has a lot to do with Ruin's influence. Not to make the guy who's committing eugenics look better than he is. But I do think that's interesting that it was the Canton of Inquisition that suggested that. Also, when discussing the Inquisitors, it's hard to not mention the Conventicle of Saran, which, if you remember, is where they travel to, Marsh and Sazed in Well of Ascension, and where Sazed finds Quan's inscription to learn that freeing what is at the well is absolutely not a good idea. And yet, that fateful day is when we began to learn the lesson that nothing not written in metal can be trusted. The conventicle was actually originally founded as a laboratory of sorts for hemalurgical experiments that the Lord Ruler was conducting, trying to make other constructs, but he was only ever able to create the Khandra and the Koloss and the Inquisitors. He could never figure anything else out. So it's interesting that we see it more in Era 2, and we see these kind of chimera-like creatures made with hemalurgy. Makes you wonder what pieces were missing for Rashik. With all of this tension within the Steel Ministry, especially between the Canton of Orthodoxy and the Canton of Inquisition, it's very interesting to think about what the pecking order really is for these groups. Above everyone was the Lord Praelin, which Lord Praelin Tavidian was Vin's father. And then below him were the Steel Inquisitors, High Praelins, Praelins, and Obligators. The Inquisitors, though, kind of existed outside of the chain of command. The culture within the ministry is also very interesting because it doesn't act much different than any other noble house. Each canton and obligators and high praelins, etc., within these cantons were very much vying. It's very bureaucratic, and they were also just vying for more power and influence themselves. It was very much influenced by as much corruption as anything else. And that's sort of part of the problem, is they were very corrupt. And a lot of what happened with the Inquisitors and the Obligators was that the Inquisitors were sowing seeds within the Obligators, influencing them to be more corrupt so that they would end up in this place where the Inquisitors could take their power back. Very conniving. Very interesting. Oh, it's so interesting. I wish we had 1 million books about it. Or at least 3 more. There also were no restrictions on women being obligators or members of the ministry. Women could be. It really just, allomantic ability was really the main deciding factor, but it didn't matter. There were female obligators all the time. It just isn't something we really saw or heard about. Allomantic ability actually influenced a lot of the culture and sort of rising through the ranks. The most valuable Mistings to be recruited and to rise up quickly were Seekers, which is part of why Marsh rises so quickly, because he's very talented with bronze, and just generally speaking, he was doing everything. He knew the ministry probably better than many of the people actually in it because he'd been studying them for so long. The only misting seemingly more valuable than a seeker was an ATM misting, which we meet one obviously in Hero of Ages. Yeoman was a seer or an ATM misting. And it's very interesting how they would find out who was an ATM misting. The Inquisitors would lace, essentially, the drinks at these balls with atium and then cause a disturbance and get people all hyped up, and they would burn bronze to see who was burning atium. And then they would take them, basically. It is also interesting to note that if someone who does not have an allomantic ability joins the ministry, they are given atium, and then there is an attempt made to break them so they snap and start to burn atium. And that, I believe, is how they figured out that Yeoman was an atium misting, which sucks. It is also important to note that they are not told that they are given that atium. They are just given atium some way, likely through food or drink, and then put through all of these trials and rituals and all of these things to try to make them snap. Hi, sorry, editing Audrey here. I didn't think I'd ever do this thing, because I like to have everything done before I sit down. If you can't tell by my else caller flag here, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but I did leave out a couple essential points that I wanted to bring up. What I wanted to talk about really quickly about the atium mistings was that the reason why they were so valuable and why Rashik kept them a secret was because, I mean, the power to know what your opponent will do seconds before they do it makes you a super warrior. Like, unbeatable, essentially. You don't even have to be technically very skilled to then be successful in a battle with atium. Not to mention, if you're also a skilled warrior, like a skilled fighter, it's just not even worth it unless you're Vin Venture to fight someone with atium if you don't have that ability, especially among the mistings. So that is part of why it was a knowledge is power situation. Brandon talks about it in the Hero of Ages annotations for chapter 74 about how it was knowledge is power, and if he can keep that to himself and keep those potentially superpowered warriors to himself, he's in a good spot. So that's kind of part of why the atium mistings specifically were more valuable. Also, they could burn atium. That's a plus, as we see at the end of Hero of Ages. So, what did the Steel Ministry believe? So this is really interesting. I'm going to go through this almost twice. We're going to go through what they believe, and then we're going to go through the facts that we have and kind of compare the ways in which some things might have been mythologized or just straight up made up, just based on my research, sort of what we have here. So the very first belief that was very prevalent in the Steel Ministry was that Ska are bad and noblemen are good. So Ska were cursed because they rejected the Lord Ruler, they didn't obey him, they weren't loyal, so that's what happened to the Ska. And the noblemen are descended from the men who worked with the Lord Ruler when he ascended, his friends, these people who were loyal to him, and that's why they have allomancy and the ability to become Mistborn. The Mistborn are like the most powerful because they come from the most powerful bloodlines, the ones that were closest to him, etc. The Lord Ruler is the sliver of infinity, that he was the creator of the world, a piece of God, their God, a living physical being that was part of God, essentially, which is not untrue, I suppose. He's not all-knowing and he's not everywhere, but he is very much a piece of God. Then sort of the big piece of scripture around the Lord Ruler's ascension, and a lot of the mythology around it as well, is just about the deepness. The Lord Ruler slayed the deepness and then punished the people for doubting him with ash and fire and mist. Other than that, that's really all most people are taught. The religion itself is largely handled by the different cantons, specifically the Canton of Orthodoxy and at times the Canton of Inquisition, because the Lord Ruler didn't care about the people being particularly reverent of him. He cared that they fulfilled their societal roles, and that was it. The praising him and worship, etc., that was on the Canton of Orthodoxy to do, which there's some interesting stuff about that as well. We know that ritual practice was involved in some way, but we don't really know the specifics. When we get into Credit Shaw for the first time in book 1, we see Vin run into that room where there's the big golden altar and Alendi's logbook is in there. There's also a bowl full of tiny razors. And we find out later in the Hero of Ages annotations that those were used in rituals where the worshiper would slice into their body and cause themselves to bleed. But we don't know why. Like, there's no more information on that. I'm sure it's some kind of a self-punishing, but I'm so fascinated by that. I wish we had more about it. Brandon, tell me more about it, please. Anyway, the priests were entirely responsible for the worship, the daily prayer, etc. The people weren't really expected to do that. which is something that Sazed then remarks in the Words of Founding later, that it's very interesting that he cared a lot more about them just fulfilling their roles. He created his religion and created this world almost entirely, as far as the people were concerned, around like to be run like an institution, to be run like a government, based off of these people on Scadrial before the Ascension, known as the Halant people, which is another rabbit hole we'll go down eventually, because if you notice, Halant and Hallandren, very similar roots and very similar political and religious structures. So maybe there will be a whole separate video on that soon when we get to the iridescent tones. But today we're talking about the Steel Ministry. Another belief of the Steel Ministry that was taught throughout the entire Final Empire was the balance. This idea that the Lord Ruler had specifically ensured that there would be a balance of not too many noblemen and enough ska to maintain the workings of society, work the plantations, etc. And this was just a commonly held religious belief. And this is kind of the perfect transition into what the facts are of the situation that we actually have information for. So the balance actually was a real thing. It wasn't just this made up ministry doctrine in a way. So the Lord Ruler had made it so that they were biologically different. The noblemen were taller and they were less fertile and predisposed to allomancy, while the ska were shorter and stockier, like better built for working. All of them were changed biologically to be able to ingest the food that was being created from living under ash, etc., and less sunlight than normal. Obviously, vegetation and everything was completely changed after the Ascension. But also, ska were made to be significantly more fertile. When they're discussing this in the Final Empire, Ham says that he's known ska women to bear up to 12 children, but he has never heard of a noble family that had more than 3. So there is actual, legitimate, testable evidence of this within their society. Although, over time, there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two groups, so some things did not remain true. Not every nobleman was much taller, but that is part of why Marsh and Kelsier are taller than the average ska. Specifically, I know Marsh is much taller, but him and Kelsier aren't that far apart in height, if I remember correctly. Regardless, they're pretty tall, and part of it is because of their noble ancestry. A couple other facts around the Ascension. So obviously, they keep Alendi's logbook, and Rashik just maintains that he is the Lord Ruler, and that's the Lord Ruler's logbook as far as we know. But of course, he is not Alendi, he is Rashik. So the Pac-Man Rashik killed Alendi at his uncle's behest to ensure that he couldn't take the power at the well. So that's sort of the first big thing. He's not the creator of the Earth, but he did move the planet closer to the sun to try to dispel the mists, because it was believed that the mists were just as much a part of the deepness as the dark mist was. And it didn't work, obviously. He scorched the earth, which is why he brought up the ash mounts and created ash cover to keep the planet from burning, essentially. Another falsehood is that the Mistborn are not descended from the most loyal friends of the Lord Ruler. Mistborn are actually descended from the 8 kings that the Lord Ruler was unable to subjugate when he began his subjugation of the entire world. He bribed them with Lerasium beads, which is why they became Mistborn and how those bloodlines started. It was not due to loyalty or friendship. It was bribery. He did not, in fact, himself ingest Lerasium as well to become a Mistborn. He just remade himself to be one when he had the power. And another fun fact, kind of, not very fun, about the Ascension and about the Kandra specifically, is that the first generation of Kandra that we see are the other terracemen who were up with him at the Well of Ascension at the time of his ascension. He had them agree to become these creatures, these like mist-wraith-like creatures, and they did not realize that they were agreeing on behalf of all living Feruchemists to become these creatures. So every Feruchemist that was alive at that moment in time was turned into a mist-wraith. And that's where the mist-wraiths come from. The mist-wraiths do, over time, learn how to reproduce somehow. We don't have any more information about that. But that's where they come from. So it's very interesting as well. You have the firsts and then the seconds, thirds, etc., as we know, that all at one time, many of them at one time, were those early Feruchemists. I'm back again. Sorry. I just wanted to hop in really quickly and say that exactly what was offered to the Feruchemists, what would end up being the first generation of Kandra, was to give up their Feruchemy for immortality, essentially. That was the agreement that was being made, that they were kind of swindled into making. Quan was also given this offer, and he refused. He said, this is completely against who we are, what we are as Terrace people, what we stand for, what humanity is. And so he rejected it, and Rashik tried to destroy him, but the power of preservation wouldn't allow him to. So Quan ran away and hid, and within the year, Rashik found him and took him out. But that is the full story of how that went. Isn't that crazy? It's interesting as well, because what the Lord Ruler didn't account for was that Feruchemists would still be born through the Terrace bloodline. Very strange. Very interesting that he didn't account for that at all. Of course, he also flattened the Terrace Mountains and brought them up elsewhere and called those the Terrace Mountains, and then established Luthadel on top of what was the Well of Ascension, so that if anyone tried to find it again in the future, they wouldn't be able to find it because they all would think that it was in the Terrace Mountains, but obviously no longer true. It is also important to note that about 800 years into Rashik's reign, which was 200 and a half years before he died, he began creating the storage caches. So he created 5 that had different levels of resources, each one bigger than the last that they had discovered. And those were established at different points in the final empire. That being said, I mean, it was all a fail-safe in case he failed, which is an interesting thing that he had this revelation sort of 800 years into his reign. There also, Brandon has said that there was a point in time in which Rashik wanted to give up, and he tried to dismantle the final empire, but it didn't take. Not sure why. Of course, we don't have a lot of scripture of any kind necessarily, or dogma that were really shown of this religion. We don't have a lot of sayings that were taught or anything of that nature. We're not familiar with any texts other than the logbook, which doesn't seem to necessarily be their Bible, right? Like, it's very interesting. We don't know. We really don't know about that, and we don't know what they base their prayers or rituals off of. I would love to know. Again, Brandon, please tell me everything. I won't tell anyone. Anyway, one specific saying, I think it's the only time in any of the books that we get anything like this. Yeoman, as Yeoman is meeting with Elend in Fadric City, he says to him, there's a saying in the Steel Ministry, sit down to dine with evil, and you will ingest it with your meal. Such an interesting saying. I realize that it's very familiar in a lot of religious cultures, and just even in our daily society today, and just even in our daily day-to-day society today, we hear things similar to this about, don't negotiate with people that you don't agree with, or fundamentally if they're evil, right? Or if they are evil, I guess. But I can't help but feel like there's more to this. A couple of thoughts that came to mind were that it might have something to do with hemalurgy, sitting down to dine with evil, using hemalurgy, the power of ruin. You ingest it with your meal, you become infected with the power of ruin and his voice in your head and these influences, which is interesting in and of itself, and also just the influence in general, or the way that it impacts you. Or maybe it's this idea of allomancy being a problem, though allomancy was so revered in the ministry. I just can't imagine it was a negative about that at all. There were no, as far as we know, purists within the ministry when it was such a big deal to be a misting in the ministry itself. There's a lot to it, I think, that could just be really interesting. Obviously, I do think it is the saying of, like, don't negotiate with terrorists, or don't be so open-minded or you'll lose your mind, or just these ideas that keep us separate. How interesting, though, because all other religions, all other belief systems had been crushed within the first 500 years of Rashik's dominion. He really, he took care of them. He made sure to. He erased every element of these religions from his culture. It was in that 500-year range that he would find any stragglers and destroy them, which is why the Terrace Keepers are such a big deal. And so interesting that he didn't account for that, but obviously, he did what he could. or what he thought was right. It's so interesting to dive deeper into this, or these ideas of what they actually believed, like morally, ethically. That's what I want to know. But because the religion wasn't a part of the daily life of any of these people, they would curse by the Lord ruler, but they didn't revere him outside of just knowing he was their God. There was no daily prayer among the ska. Like, these things just didn't happen. And so we don't see that. It doesn't really necessarily infect the society in the same way as other religions do today in our world. So there's just a lot missing, and I really wish that we had some of that context, because it just makes it so much more rich to me. I would love to know what moral apprehensions the obligators would have. It is especially interesting just considering the Canton of Orthodoxy not seeming to adhere very closely to any morality other than through appearance. We do have Norden and Yeoman are the two obligators that we spend kind of somewhat considerable time with. Norden just seems like a pleasant guy, mostly. And Yeoman is very pious and very dedicated to his belief and very intense. I just wish we'd gotten a little bit more from him just around the culture, more of those quotes and sayings and things. Although he's been through so much, and he really, very smart, very capable, really liked Yeoman a lot, and spending more time with him would have been cool. But regardless, I hope that you've enjoyed this video on the Steel Ministry. It was a lot of fun to put together and research and just spend time in that headspace. I really am so invested in it, and I wish that there was more about it. I love Scadrial just in general. Era 1 is my favorite kind of environment that we exist in for long periods of time. It's just so fascinating to me. I love Roshar, don't get me wrong. I really, really do. But as far as the religions go, the Steel Ministry is one of those ones that I think about a lot. So I believe my next video will probably be on the iridescent tones, because there's a lot of crossover in those two cultures that I think isn't a coincidence, which I'll explain more later. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and liking and commenting and telling me what you think. I really would like to keep having this conversation as we prep for the next religion. Which one do you want to see next? Do you want to see the iridescent tones? Are you most excited for one in particular? We talk a lot. I get a lot of comments about the one. So that is definitely going to be coming soon as well. This is just such a cool project I'm excited to be doing. So tell me what you think. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok. I have a website as well that should be linked down below. Join the Discord so you can join our conversations. And most importantly, please consider joining the Cosmere Nerds for Mental Health Ko-fi page, where all proceeds every month go directly to Nerd HQ to help fund therapy for those in need. You get early access to my videos, as well as tons of other cool things. The Next Ideal podcast by Steve the Cosmerenaut and his friend Dr. Ben Jepson. It's so amazing. We have also an exclusive podcast by Edge Dancing Through Life and Ghost Buddies known as Coffee and Creme. So come join the crew. So many cool perks to learn about there. The link will be below as well. This is so much fun. Let's keep talking about this. And thank you so much for watching. May the Lord Ruler bless you.